Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most spectacular administrative disasters. The time an entire nation just deleted 11 days from existence. We're talking about England in 1752, when the government basically said, Wednesday, September send. Nah, let's skip straight to Thursday, September 14th, and somehow convinced an entire country to go along with this temporal madness. The story of how Britain finally swallowed its Protestant pride, admitted the Pope had been right about something, and joined the rest of civilized Europe in actually knowing what day it was. So before we travel back to witness this magnificent calendar catastrophe, take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying the journey, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our little community scattered across the globe, probably all checking their calendars to make sure their days are still there. Now settle in, maybe grab some tea if you're feeling historically appropriate, and let's explore the delightfully chaotic story of how England lost nearly 2 weeks and somehow called it progress. So, you think losing your keys is confusing, adorable? Try losing 11 entire days and having to explain to your neighbours why yesterday was September 2nd, but tomorrow is September 14th. Picture this, you're living in 1752, minding your own business, maybe picking turnips, or dying of plague like a respectable citizen, when suddenly the government decides that Wednesday, September 2nd, will be immediately followed by Thursday, September 14th, not September 3rd, September 14th. 11 days gone, vanished, deleted from existence like a poorly written love letter. Welcome to the great calendar catastrophe of 1752, where Britain finally admitted that maybe, just maybe, the Pope had a point about something. It only took them 170 years to swallow their Protestant pride and acknowledge that their calendar was wandering off into mathematical la land like a drunken astronomer with a broken compass. But let's back up, way up, to a time when keeping track of dates was about as precise as throwing darts blindfolded while riding a unicycle. The Romans, bless their conquering hearts, had given the world many things: roads, aqueducts, the concept of wearing a bedsheet to formal occasions, and a calendar so magnificently broken it made a Swiss watch look like a sundial made of cheese. The Roman calendar, you see, was originally a lunar affair with 10 months and 304 days, because apparently March through December was all the year anyone needed. January and February, irrelevant. Winter was just a vague, snowy intermission between real months. It was like deciding that weekends don't count because work is more important. The Romans were practical people, but their practicality had the mathematical precision of a toddler with finger paints. Then along came Julius Caesar, a man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and decided that if he could reorganize half the known world, he could certainly fix a calendar. Caesar looked at the Roman dating system, which by his time had wandered so far from astronomical reality that spring festivals were happening in what should have been autumn, and said, "This is ridiculous. I'm fixing this." So Caesar, being Caesar, didn't just tweak the system. He brought in the big gun Sosigenes, an Alexandrian astronomer who probably spent his days calculating eclipses and his nights wondering why he'd moved to Rome. Sosigenes explained that the Earth takes approximately 365.25 days to orbit the Sun, not the 355 days the Romans had been half-heartedly pretending was correct. The solution? Add a leap day every 4 years and create a solar calendar with 365 days. The Julian calendar was born in 45 BCE, and it was revolutionary. Suddenly, dates made sense. Seasons occurred when they were supposed to. Farmers could actually predict when to plant crops without consulting chicken entrails or waiting for politically convenient omens. It was beautiful, elegant, and almost correct. Almost. See, Sosigenes made a tiny, nearly imperceptible mistake. The Earth doesn't take exactly 365.25 days to orbit the Sun. It takes 365.22 days. The difference? About 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year. 11 minutes? You lose more time than that waiting for your morning coffee to brew. But 11 minutes a year, year after year, century after century, adds up like compound interest on a loan from a particularly vindictive banker. By the time the Roman Empire was transitioning into various fragments and arguing about whether the Pope or the Emperor should wear the fanciest hat, those 11 minutes had accumulated into hours. Those hours had become days. The Julian calendar was drifting away from astronomical reality like a boat with a very slow leak. But here's where things get interesting. because this wasn't just about timekeeping. This was about Easter. Easter, you see, isn't just any holiday. It's the cornerstone of Christian theology, the celebration of resurrection, the big kahuna of religious observance. And Easter's date is calculated based on the lunar cycle and the spring equinox. Specifically, Easter occurs on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox. Got that? It's like a cosmic game of religious calendar twister. The problem was that the Julian calendar's slow drift meant that the calculated date of the spring equinox was gradually moving away from the actual astronomical event. By the 16th century, the calendar said the spring equinox occurred on March 11th, when astronomically it was happening on March 21st. Easter was wandering around the calendar like a lost tourist looking for the right weekend to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. This drove the Catholic Church absolutely bonkers. Here they were, trying to coordinate the celebration of Christianity's most important holiday across all of Christendom, and their calendar was playing practical jokes on them. It was like trying to organize a surprise party when the guest of honor's birthday keeps changing. Enter Pope Gregory VI, a man with a magnificent beard and an even more magnificent determination to fix this temporal mess. Gregory wasn't just any pope, he was a pope with a passion for precision. He looked at the calendar situation the way a master craftsman looks at a wonky table leg, with intense irritation and absolute determination to make it right. Gregory assembled a team that would make NASA jealous: astronomers, mathematicians, theologians, and calendar experts, the best minds of the 16th century, huddled together in Vatican chambers, calculating and recalculating the movements of celestial bodies with an obsession that bordered on the mystical. They were like a religious version of the Avengers, except instead of fighting supervillains, they were battling temporal drift. The solution they developed was elegant in its complexity. First, they would correct the accumulated error by jumping forward 10 days. October 4th, 1582 would be immediately followed by October 15th, 1582. 10 days, deleted from history like an embarrassing diary entry. Second, they would prevent future drift by modifying the leap year rule. Years divisible by 100 would not be leap years unless they were also divisible by 400. So 1600 would be a leap year, but 1700, 1800, and 1900 would not be. It was mathematically beautiful, astronomically accurate, and practically revolutionary. The Gregorian calendar was born on October 15th, 1582, and Catholic Europe embraced it like a perfectly fitted suit after years of wearing clothes that didn't quite match. But here's where the story gets deliciously complicated, because not everyone was Catholic, and not everyone appreciated the Pope telling them what day it was. Protestant Europe looked at this Gregorian calendar reform and said, essentially, that's nice, but we'd rather be wrong than agree with Rome. It wasn't about mathematics or astronomy, it was about principle. The Protestant Reformation had spent decades establishing that the Pope wasn't infallible, and now he wanted to tell them what day Tuesday was. Absolutely not. So Europe split into two temporal zones: Catholic countries using the new style, Gregorian calendar, and Protestant countries clinging to the old style, Julian calendar, like a security blanket. It was the geopolitical equivalent of different countries driving on different sides of the road, except instead of just being confusing for tourists, it made international diplomacy a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to negotiate a treaty when your calendar says it's March 5th, but your negotiating partner insists it's March 15th. Imagine merchants trying to establish delivery dates when London and Paris were operating on different temporal realities. Imagine the sheer bureaucratic chaos of trying to coordinate anything across these calendar borders. France and Spain were celebrating Easter on one date, while England and the German Protestant states were celebrating it 11 days earlier, or later, depending on your perspective. Christmas in Catholic Vienna occurred 11 days before Christmas in Protestant Berlin. It was as if Europe had developed temporal schizophrenia, and England was magnificently, stubbornly committed to being wrong. Not just wrong, but defiantly wrong. Protestant to its core, and suspicious of anything that smacked of papal authority, England continued using the Julian calendar, while the rest of Catholic Europe moved into the astronomical future. English merchants would arrive in Amsterdam only to discover that all their meetings had been scheduled for last week, or next week, depending on which calendar the other party was using. The English approach to this calendar chaos was characteristically pragmatic. They ignored it. If the Pope wanted to change the calendar, that was his business. England would continue using the calendar God had apparently intended, which happened to be the one Julius Caesar had established back when Rome was conquering Britain. Never mind that Julius Caesar had been dead for over 600 years and probably wouldn't have recognized Christianity if it had performed miracles in front of him. But ignoring reality, as England would eventually discover, doesn't make reality go away. It just makes reality more inconvenient. By the 18th century, the Julian calendar was drifting even further from astronomical truth. What had been a 10-day difference in 1582 had become an 11-day difference by 1700. England's calendar wasn't just wrong, it was getting more wrong every century. The spring equinox, which should have occurred around March 21st, was happening on March 10th according to the English calendar. Easter was wandering around like a confused holiday, looking for the right Sunday to occur. English astronomers were painfully aware of this problem. They could calculate the positions of planets, predict eclipses, and navigate ships across oceans, but their official calendar was off by 11 days. It was like being a master chef who insists on using a broken oven. You can still cook, but everything comes out slightly wrong, and everyone else is wondering why you don't just fix the obvious problem. The scientific community in England was increasingly embarrassed. Here they were, leading the world in physics, mathematics, and astronomy, while officially maintaining that March 10th was the spring equinox. Isaac Newton had revolutionized our understanding of gravity and motion, but England still couldn't figure out what day it was supposed to be. International relations were becoming increasingly complex. When England declared war on France, which calendar determined the official start date? When English diplomats negotiated treaties, were the dates written in Old Style or New Style? English merchants trading in Europe had to maintain two sets of books, one for English dates and one for European dates. It was like operating in two different time zones, except the time zones were in the same geographical locations. The situation reached peak absurdity in 1700, when most of Protestant Europe finally capitulated and adopted the Gregorian calendar. Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands abandoned their temporal protest and joined the rest of civilized Europe in acknowledging what day it actually was. England, however, remained defiant. Along with Russia and a few other holdouts, England continued to inhabit its own private temporal universe. By this point, the English calendar situation had become an international joke. European diplomats would arrive in London and joke about travelling back in time. English travellers to the continent would experience temporal jet lag without leaving the same longitude. It was as if England had decided that Greenwich Mean Time applied, not just to longitude, but to centuries. The pressure to change came from multiple directions. Scientists were embarrassed. Merchants were frustrated. Diplomats were confused. And ordinary citizens were starting to ask reasonable questions like, why does Easter happen on a different day in London than it does in Paris? And, if we're so great at everything else, why can't we figure out what day it is? The final push came from an unexpected source: money. England's growing international trade was being hampered by calendar confusion. Bills of exchange, shipping schedules, and financial contracts were becoming increasingly complex when they had to account for two different calendar systems. When money is involved, even the most stubborn principles tend to become more flexible. Lord Chesterfield, a man who combined political influence with astronomical knowledge, became the unlikely champion of calendar reform. Chesterfield wasn't just a politician. He was a man who understood that England's continued use of the Julian calendar was making the country look backward and provincial. In an age when England was positioning itself as a modern, enlightened nation, maintaining an outdated calendar system was like insisting on travelling by horse when everyone else had discovered carriages. Chesterfield introduced the Calendar Act in Parliament in 1750, and the debate that followed was magnificent in its combination of practical necessity and wounded national pride. Supporters argued that England needed to join the rest of civilized Europe in using a calendar that actually corresponded to astronomical reality. Opponents worried that changing the calendar was somehow surrendering to papal authority, even though the Pope in question had been dead for over 150 years. The opposition to calendar reform was delightfully paranoid. Some members of Parliament argued that adopting the Gregorian calendar was a Catholic plot to undermine Protestant England. Others worried that changing the calendar would somehow affect property rights, legal contracts, and the natural order of society. A few suggested that God had intended England to use the Julian calendar, apparently believing that the Almighty had strong opinions about leap year calculations. But the most entertaining opposition came from those who worried about the practical implications of losing 11 days. What would happen to people's wages? Would workers lose 11 days of pay? Would rent be prorated? Would people's birthdays change? The debate sometimes resembled a philosophical discussion about the nature of time itself, conducted by people who weren't entirely sure how calendars worked. Chesterfield, bless his patient soul, explained repeatedly that no time would actually be lost. People wouldn't age 11 days in a single night. Workers wouldn't lose wages. The sun would still rise and set at the same times. The only thing changing was how they numbered the days, not the actual passage of time. It was like changing the labels on bottles without changing the contents. Despite the opposition, practical necessity eventually won. The Calendar Act passed in 1751, establishing that England would adopt the Gregorian calendar in September 1752. Wednesday, September 2, 1752 would be followed by Thursday, September 14, 1752. 11 days would be excised from English history, like a surgeon removing an infected appendix. The Act also changed the beginning of the legal year from March 25th to January 1st, bringing England in line with most of the rest of Europe. This was almost as significant as the calendar change itself, because it meant that England would no longer be celebrating New Year's Day in the middle of spring. The legal year would finally correspond to what most people considered the actual year. Parliament's preparation for this temporal surgery was meticulous. They issued proclamations explaining the change. They published pamphlets reassuring citizens that no actual time would be lost. They worked with employers to ensure that workers wouldn't lose wages. They coordinated with other government departments to ensure that legal documents, tax records, and official correspondence would transition smoothly. But despite all this preparation, the announcement of the calendar change unleashed a spectacular wave of public confusion, superstition, and outright panic. The average English citizen in 1752 wasn't particularly well versed in astronomical calculations or calendar mathematics. Most people understood time in practical terms: market days, holy days, harvest seasons, and the cycle of births, deaths, and taxes. The idea that the government could simply delete 11 days from existence was both incomprehensible and terrifying. Rumours spread like wildfire through coffee houses, taverns, and markets. Some people believed that losing 11 days would literally shorten their lives. Others worried that debts due in September would somehow become immediately payable. A few were convinced that the calendar change was part of a larger conspiracy to confuse and control the population. Religious concerns were particularly intense. If the government could change the calendar, what else might they change? Would saints' feast days be affected? Would the Sabbath still fall on the correct day? Some worried that changing the calendar would somehow interfere with God's plan for the universe, as if the Almighty was running on Greenwich Mean Time and would be confused by the adjustment. The most persistent rumour was that landlords would somehow cheat tenants out of 11 days' rent, or that workers would lose 11 days' wages. Despite repeated government assurances that all financial obligations would be adjusted proportionally, the fear persisted. It was as if people believed that the calendar change would somehow allow the wealthy to steal time itself. As September 1752 approached, the anxiety reached fever pitch. Street preachers proclaimed that the end times were near. Almanac publishers rushed to create special editions explaining the new calendar. Merchants posted notices about how the change would affect business operations. The entire country seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when 11 days simply vanished. September 2nd, 1752 dawned like any other Wednesday. People woke up, ate breakfast, and went about their daily business. Children played in the streets. Merchants opened their shops. Farmers tended their fields. It was a perfectly ordinary day, remarkable only for the fact that it would be the last September 2nd that England would experience for exactly 1 year. When the clock struck midnight, marking the end of Wednesday, September 2nd. Something unprecedented in English history occurred Thursday, September 14th began. 11 days simply ceased to exist. They weren't moved, delayed, or rescheduled. They were deleted from the timeline like a scribe correcting an error in a manuscript. The immediate reaction was anticlimactic. The sun rose on September 14th just as it would have risen on September 3rd. Birds sang, cows needed milking. Life continued exactly as it had the day before, except that the date was different. People who had gone to bed on September 2nd woke up on September 14th with nothing changed except the numbers on their calendars. But the psychological impact was enormous. England had collectively experienced something unprecedented: institutional time travel. The government had literally edited history in real time. It was as if someone had torn 11 pages out of the national diary while everyone was sleeping. Some citizens handled the transition with characteristic English pragmatism. Shopkeepers updated their ledgers, clerks adjusted their record keeping, and life went on. The sky hadn't fallen. Nobody had aged 11 days overnight. Wages were still paid on schedule. The world continued to spin on its axis as if nothing had happened. But others struggled to accept the new temporal reality. There were scattered protests, though they were more confused than angry. Some people demanded their 11 days back, as if the days were physical objects that could be returned like borrowed books. A few refused to acknowledge the new calendar dates, continuing to write September 3rd, 4th, 5th in their personal records. The most famous protest allegedly occurred in Bristol, where crowds supposedly gathered chanting, "Give us back our 11 days!" This story has become legendary, though historians debate whether it actually happened or whether it's an exaggerated tale that captured the spirit of public confusion. Either way, it represents the deep unease that many felt about the calendar change. Religious communities were particularly affected. Some churches initially refused to adjust their celebration dates, leading to confusion about when holy days should be observed. A few denominations worried that changing the calendar would somehow affect the spiritual significance of religious observances. It was as if they believed that God was keeping time using the Julian calendar and might be confused by England's temporal rebellion. The adjustment period lasted months. Business correspondents had to specify whether dates were given in old style or new style. Legal documents required careful dating to avoid confusion. International trade became slightly less complicated, but domestic record keeping became temporarily more complex as people adjusted to the new system. Birth records from this period are fascinating historical documents. Children born in September 1752 have birthday certificates that seem to jump through time. Someone born on September 2nd would have their first birthday on September 2nd, 1753, but anyone born on September 14th, 1752 had their birthday on what would have been September 3rd under the old system. It was like a massive game of temporal musical chairs. The financial implications were exactly as complex as Parliament had feared. Rents, wages, and debts all had to be carefully recalculated. A yearly lease that should have run from September 1st to September 1st now had 11 fewer days. Monthly wages had to be prorated. Quarterly tax payments needed adjustment. The entire economic system required a mathematical facelift. But perhaps the most interesting effect was psychological. England had always prided itself on tradition, continuity, and historical consciousness. The calendar change represented a fundamental break with the past. For the first time in English history, there were dates that had never existed. Future historians would have an 11-day gap in the historical record, a temporal hiccup that marked the moment when England finally joined the modern world. The international reaction to England's calendar change was mixed. European courts expressed polite satisfaction that England had finally seen reason and adopted the correct calendar. French newspapers ran mildly sarcastic articles about England's belated entry into the 18th century. Spanish diplomats noted with amusement that England had taken 170 years to admit that the Pope had been right about something. But there was also genuine relief in international circles. Diplomatic correspondence immediately became simpler. Trade negotiations no longer required dual calendar calculations. Military alliances could be coordinated without temporal confusion. For the first time since 1582, all of Western Europe was operating on the same calendar system. The Church of England's official position on the calendar change was carefully neutral. Anglican theologians had spent months developing theological justifications for adopting a calendar reform, originally implemented by the Catholic Church. Their solution was elegantly pragmatic. They argued that calendar keeping was a matter of practical necessity, not religious doctrine. God cared about the human heart, not the mathematical precision of leap year calculations. This theological flexibility was remarkable, considering that England had originally rejected the Gregorian calendar specifically because it came from Rome. By 1752, anti-Catholic sentiment was still strong, but practical necessity had trumped religious prejudice. It was as if England had finally decided that being right was more important than being righteously stubborn. The scientific community celebrated the calendar change as a triumph of reason over tradition. The Royal Society published papers explaining the astronomical basis of the reform. English astronomers could finally publish observations using dates that matched their international colleagues. Navigators could use star charts and almanacs published anywhere in Europe without worrying about temporal conversion. Isaac Newton, had he still been alive, would have appreciated the irony. Here was England, the country that had produced the man who explained the mathematical laws governing planetary motion, finally adjusting its calendar to match those very same mathematical laws. It was like a master clockmaker finally fixing his own timepiece. The agricultural impact was subtler but significant. Farmers had always operated according to natural seasons rather than calendar dates. The calendar change didn't affect when crops needed planting or harvesting, but it did affect market days, legal contracts, and seasonal labor agreements. A harvest scheduled for late September now occurred 11 days earlier on the calendar, even though it happened at exactly the same point in the agricultural year. Folk traditions faced similar adjustments. Traditional festivals tied to specific calendar dates had to be rescheduled, while celebrations based on natural phenomena remained unchanged. May Day celebrations continued to mark the arrival of spring, but now they occurred on a different numerical date relative to the rest of the calendar year. The long-term effects of the calendar change were profound, but subtle. England's temporal isolation had ended. For the first time since the Reformation, England was fully synchronized with continental Europe. This synchronization facilitated everything from international trade to scientific collaboration to diplomatic relations. But the psychological impact may have been most significant. England had demonstrated that even the most fundamental aspects of daily life could be changed when necessity demanded it. The calendar reform represented a triumph of practical reasoning over traditional stubbornness. It showed that England could adapt, evolve, and admit mistakes when the evidence was overwhelming. The calendar change also marked England's full entry into the Enlightenment. By adopting the Gregorian calendar, England was acknowledging that mathematical accuracy was more important than political or religious prejudice. It was a victory for scientific reasoning over ideological rigidity. Scotland's experience with the calendar change was particularly interesting because Scotland had been using the Julian calendar's New Year date, January 1st, since 1600, but had retained the Julian calendar's dating system. When the calendar reform occurred, Scotland gained the 11-day adjustment, but didn't need to change its New Year date. It was like getting half a temporal makeover. Ireland's situation was more complex because Ireland had a mix of Catholic and Protestant populations. Catholics had been unofficially using the Gregorian calendar for religious purposes, while officially following the Julian calendar for legal and civil purposes. The 1752 reform finally unified these dual systems, though it took time for all communities to fully adjust. The American colonies, being under English rule, also experienced the 11-day jump. Colonial newspapers published explanations of the calendar change, and American merchants had to adjust their transatlantic business correspondence. The calendar reform was one of the last major administrative changes that the American colonies experienced before the Revolutionary War made such concerns irrelevant. By the end of 1752, the calendar change had largely been absorbed into the fabric of English life. People stopped talking about old style and new style dates. Children born after the change grew up never knowing that 11 days had been deleted from their parents' lives. The calendar reform became just another historical curiosity, like the Great Fire of London or the execution of Charles I. But the deeper significance remained. England had faced an uncomfortable truth that mathematical reality doesn't care about political preferences. The calendar reform forced England to acknowledge that astronomical facts were more important than national pride. It was a lesson in humility disguised as administrative efficiency. The Calendar Act of 1751 also established several important precedents. It showed that Parliament could make fundamental changes to daily life when necessary. It demonstrated that scientific accuracy could override traditional practice. Most importantly, it proved that England could learn from its mistakes, even when those mistakes involved admitting that a Catholic pope had been right about something. Looking back from the 21st century, the English calendar reform of 1752 seems like an obviously necessary correction to an obviously broken system. Of course, England should have adopted the astronomically accurate calendar. Of course, maintaining a calendar that was 11 days off was impractical and embarrassing. Of course, scientific accuracy should trump religious or political prejudice. But in 1752, these conclusions weren't obvious at all. The calendar change required England to overcome centuries of anti-Catholic sentiment, decades of stubborn pride, and deep suspicions about changing fundamental aspects of daily life. It required ordinary citizens to trust that their government could edit time itself without destroying the natural order. The success of the calendar reform demonstrated something important about human adaptability. People can adjust to even the most fundamental changes when those changes are clearly explained and fairly implemented. The 11-day jump could have been a social catastrophe, but it wasn't, because most people understood that the change was necessary and beneficial. The calendar reform also illustrated the power of scientific reasoning to eventually overcome political resistance. It took 170 years, but mathematical accuracy finally triumphed over ideological stubbornness. The truth about planetary motion and solar years couldn't be ignored forever, no matter how politically inconvenient it might be. Perhaps most importantly, the calendar change showed that institutions can admit mistakes and correct course without losing legitimacy. Parliament's willingness to acknowledge that England's calendar system was wrong didn't weaken governmental authority. It strengthened it by demonstrating that English institutions were capable of rational self-correction. The 11 days that England lost in September 1752 were never really lost at all. They were sacrificed to bring English time back into alignment with cosmic reality. Those days were the price of admission to the modern world, the temporal tax required to join the community of nations that had chosen accuracy over pride. Today, the Gregorian calendar is used almost universally, the system that Pope Gregory VI implemented in 1582, and that England finally adopted in 1752 now governs time-keeping across the globe. Those 11 days that caused such controversy and confusion in 1752 are now just a historical footnote. An amusing story about the time England lost nearly 2 weeks in the name of scientific progress. But the deeper lesson remains relevant. Sometimes progress requires admitting that old ways of doing things are wrong, even when those old ways are deeply embedded in tradition and national identity. Sometimes moving forward requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the past. And sometimes the most important changes are the ones that seem invisible once they're complete. The 11 days that England lost in 1752 weren't really lost at all. They were invested in a more accurate, more rational, more connected future. They were the price of joining the modern world, and in retrospect, they were worth every controversial, confusing, magnificent moment of temporal chaos they caused. The ripple effects of England's temporal surgery continued long after the immediate confusion had settled. Historians studying the period note fascinating gaps in personal diaries, church records, and business ledgers. Imagine future archaeologists trying to understand why English records from 1752 seem to skip forward 11 days like a scratched gramophone record. These missing days created permanent historical hiccups that scholars still encounter today. The genealogical implications were particularly entertaining. Family historians tracking ancestors through 1752 have to navigate this temporal pothole carefully. A great-great-grandmother who died on September 10, 1752 was followed by a great-great-grandfather born on September 14, 1752, with no days in between. Death certificates and birth certificates from this period create the illusion that people were dying and being born in rapid succession, when in reality 11 days of ordinary life had simply been legislated out of existence. Legal scholars had their own problems with the calendar change. Contracts written before the reform had to be interpreted in light of the new dates. If someone had agreed to deliver goods by the end of September 1752, did that mean the end of the shortened September, or the end of what September would have been under the old calendar? Courts spent years sorting out these temporal tangles, creating precedents for how legal time could be adjusted by governmental decree. The insurance industry, primitive as it was in 1752, faced unique challenges. Life insurance policies had to account for the fact that everyone in England had technically lived 11 fewer days in 1752 than their policies might have anticipated. Property insurance covering seasonal risks had to adjust for the fact that autumn now began 11 days earlier on the calendar, even though the actual weather patterns remained unchanged. Risk calculations that had been based on Julian calendar patterns suddenly needed Gregorian adjustments. International marriages became temporally complex. An English bride married on September 14, 1752 might have a French husband who insisted their anniversary was September 3rd, because that's when the wedding would have occurred under the continuous Gregorian calendar that France had been using since 1582. These couples had to navigate not just cultural differences, but temporal ones as well. The printing industry experienced a peculiar boom during the calendar transition. Publishers rushed to produce new almanacs, calendars, and date books that reflected the reformed system. Old almanacs became instantly obsolete, creating a massive demand for updated publications. Printers who had stockpiled 1752 calendars, showing all 12 months, suddenly found themselves with worthless inventory, though some entrepreneurial publishers marketed these, pre-reform, calendars as historical curiosities. Educational institutions faced their own challenges. University calendars had to be completely reorganized. Academic terms that should have run through September found themselves cut short. Examination schedules became confused. Students who had expected 11 more days to complete their studies suddenly found themselves facing deadlines that had jumped forward. It was like academic jet lag without the benefit of travel. The military implications were subtle but significant. Troop movements, supply deliveries, and strategic planning all had to account for the calendar change. Naval expeditions that had been planned using Julian calendar calculations suddenly found their timing off by 11 days. Military historians note that the calendar reform created a brief period of temporal confusion in British military operations, though no major disasters resulted from the adjustment. Religious dissenters, who had already separated themselves from the Church of England over various theological disputes, found the calendar change particularly troubling. Some sectarian groups viewed the adoption of the papal calendar as evidence of creeping Catholic influence in Protestant England. A few radical religious communities refused to acknowledge the calendar change at all, continuing to celebrate holy days according to the Julian system for decades after the official reform. The theatrical world adapted with characteristic creativity. Playwrights began incorporating calendar jokes into their comedies. The missing 11 days became a metaphor for lost time, missed opportunities, and temporal confusion. Theatre companies had to adjust their seasonal programming, as plays scheduled for mid-September now occurred at what felt like early October under the old system. Tavern keepers discovered that the calendar change affected their business in unexpected ways. Traditional drinking holidays had to be rescheduled. Seasonal owls that were typically ready in early September now came ready in what the calendar called mid-September. Regular customers who had been coming in for decades suddenly found their familiar rhythms disrupted by governmental temporal manipulation. The fashion industry, such as it was, had to adjust seasonal clothing releases. Garments designed for late summer now appeared during what the calendar designated as autumn. Fabric merchants who imported materials based on seasonal demand found their timing disrupted. It was as if the entire country's wardrobe had experienced temporal whiplash. Farming communities developed their own coping mechanisms. While crops didn't care what the calendar said, farmers had to adjust their record-keeping, market schedules, and seasonal labor contracts. Harvest festivals traditionally held on specific calendar dates had to choose between maintaining their numerical dates or their agricultural timing. Most chose to follow the seasons rather than the numbers, creating a permanent shift in how rural communities mark time. The banking system, primitive by modern standards but increasingly important in 1752, faced complex calculations. Interest payments, loan maturity dates, and investment schedules all required mathematical adjustments. Some financial instruments that had been calculated using Julian calendar assumptions suddenly needed Gregorian recalculations. Bankers who had never expected to become calendar experts found themselves studying astronomical tables and leap year calculations. Professional astronomers in England experienced something approaching ecstasy. After decades of embarrassment at having to use a calendar system that contradicted their own observations, they could finally publish work using dates that matched astronomical reality. The Royal Greenwich Observatory's records from 1752 show a marked improvement in the accuracy of celestial observations, not because the observations themselves became more precise, but because they could finally be dated correctly. The postal system required complete reorganization. Mail delivery schedules that had been established using Julian calendar timing suddenly needed adjustment. International correspondence became simpler, as English letters could finally be dated using the same system as European mail. Postmasters had to learn new scheduling systems and adjust their rote timing to account for the calendar change. Market towns across England experienced disruption to their traditional market days. Weekly markets that had been held every Thursday for centuries suddenly found their Thursday occurring 11 days later than expected. Some towns chose to maintain their traditional market timing regardless of the new calendar dates, while others adjusted to the new schedule. This created a patchwork of market timing that took years to fully standardize. The brewing industry faced unique challenges because fermentation times were based on natural processes that didn't recognize calendar changes. Beer that was supposed to be ready in early September was still fermenting according to its own timeline, regardless of what the calendar claimed. Brewers had to adjust their production schedules and customer expectations to account for the temporal disruption. Ship captains found themselves navigating temporal waters as well as oceanic ones. Vessels that left English ports during the calendar transition period created confusion about voyage duration and arrival times. A ship that departed on September 2nd and returned on September 14th appeared to have completed its journey in one day, when it had actually been at sea for what would have been 12 days under the old system. The art world embraced the calendar change as subject matter. Painters created allegorical works depicting time itself being adjusted by governmental decree. Satirical prints showed politicians literally stealing days from calendars, or citizens searching for their missing time. These artistic responses captured the public's mixture of confusion, amusement, and concern about the calendar reform. Clockmakers and watchmakers found their business temporarily disrupted by philosophical questions about the nature of time. If the government could delete 11 days, what did that mean for mechanical timepieces? Customers asked whether their clocks needed adjustment, not understanding that mechanical time continued unchanged while only calendar time had been altered. Some clockmakers capitalized on the confusion by marketing Gregorian adjustment services for timepieces that didn't actually need any adjustment. The gambling industry discovered new opportunities in the calendar change. Betting pools were established on everything from public reaction to the missing days to predictions about when people would stop being confused by the new system. Some enterprising gamblers even took bets on whether England would eventually change the calendar back to the Julian system, though those bets were destined to be losers. Medical practitioners faced questions about whether the calendar change would affect human health. Some patients worried that losing 11 days would somehow impact their life expectancy or natural rhythms. Physicians had to explain repeatedly that biological time continued unchanged, and that the calendar adjustment was purely administrative. A few quack doctors tried to market temporal adjustment treatments for people who claimed to feel disoriented by the missing days. The fishing industry had to reconcile traditional knowledge about tides and seasonal fish movements with the new calendar dates. Fishermen who had known for generations that certain fish appeared during the second week of September now had to adjust their expectations for what the second week of September meant. Tidal charts and fishing almanacs required complete revision. Servants and domestic workers faced confusion about wages and work schedules. Household staff who were paid monthly had to have their September wages carefully calculated to account for the shortened month. Annual contracts for domestic service required adjustment. Some employers tried to take advantage of the calendar change to reduce wages, leading to disputes that required legal resolution. The construction industry found itself dealing with completion dates that had suddenly jumped forward. Building projects scheduled for completion in late September 1752 had to be reassessed in light of the calendar change. Some contractors argued that they deserved additional time since 11 days had been removed from their timeline, while others maintained that the work should still be completed according to the natural passage of time, rather than calendar dates. Children born during the calendar transition created unique record-keeping challenges. Parish registers had to develop special notation systems to account for the missing days. Some clergy initially refused to acknowledge the calendar change in their official records, creating confusion about baptismal dates and other religious ceremonies. These records now provide fascinating glimpses into how local communities responded to the temporal disruption. The wine and spirits industry faced aging calculations that didn't account for missing days. Spirits that were supposed to age for specific periods had to be reassessed. Did a whiskey that was supposed to age for 6 months starting in March 1752 complete its aging on September 2nd or September 14th? Distillers had to develop new accounting methods for products that crossed the calendar transition period. University libraries faced the challenge of cataloguing books and documents that referenced the missing days. Academic works written before the calendar change might reference dates that no longer existed in English chronology. Librarians had to develop indexing systems that could accommodate both old-style and new-style dating systems. The textile industry discovered that seasonal fabric demands no longer matched calendar expectations. Wool merchants who traditionally saw increased demand during early autumn found that early autumn now occurred 11 days earlier on the calendar. Cotton imports scheduled for specific September dates had to be recalculated. The entire seasonal rhythm of textile commerce required temporal recalibration. International diplomatic correspondence became simultaneously simpler and more complex. While letters between England and continental Europe no longer required dual dating, all existing treaties, agreements, and diplomatic documents that referenced specific dates had to be reviewed and potentially renegotiated. Some international obligations that had been calculated using Julian calendar timing suddenly appeared to have different deadlines under the Gregorian system. The lumber industry faced seasonal harvesting schedules that no longer matched traditional calendar markers. Trees that were typically harvested during specific September periods now had to be cut according to either astronomical timing or adjusted calendar dates. Lumber merchants who had arranged seasonal deliveries found their schedules disrupted by the temporal reorganization. Weather prediction, already primitive in 1752, became even more complex as traditional seasonal markers were displaced by 11 days. Farmers and sailors who had relied on calendar-based weather predictions now had to recalibrate their expectations. Almanac publishers scrambled to revise their weather forecasting charts to account for the new calendar alignment. The calendar change created a generation of children who would grow up never experiencing the confusion their parents had felt. These children would learn the Gregorian calendar as the natural and obvious system, unable to imagine why anyone would use a calendar that was 11 days off from astronomical reality. They would become the first truly Gregorian generation in English history. Regional variations in calendar adoption created temporary pockets of temporal confusion across the country. Some remote communities continued using Julian dating for local purposes while acknowledging Gregorian dates for official business. These areas experienced a form of calendar bilingualism that persisted for years after the official change. The transition also created opportunities for calendar entrepreneurs. Publishers produced conversion charts, timing guides, and explanatory pamphlets for confused citizens. Some entrepreneurs marketed themselves as calendar consultants, who could help businesses and individuals navigate the temporal transition. a cottage industry of calendar expertise emerged around the reform. The long-term psychological impact of the calendar change may have been England's most significant gain. The country had demonstrated to itself and the world that it could acknowledge error, embrace scientific accuracy, and adapt to necessary change. This flexibility would serve England well in the coming decades as it navigated industrial revolution, political reform, and imperial expansion. The 11 days that England lost in September 1752 became a symbol of national maturation. They represented the country's willingness to prioritize accuracy over pride, science over tradition, and practical necessity over ideological stubbornness. In losing those days, England found its place in the modern world. The calendar that lost 11 days ultimately found something more valuable, a place in the accurate measurement of time, synchronized with the rest of civilization, aligned with the mathematical realities of planetary motion, and finally, after 170 years of stubborn resistance, willing to admit that sometimes even the Pope can be right about astronomy. Those missing days weren't lost at all. They were the admission price to the temporal community of nations, and they proved to be worth every confused, controversial, magnificent moment they cost.